James Joyce was born in Dublin on February 2nd in 1882. His father, John Stanislaus Joyce, was originally from Cork, and his mother, Mary May Murray Joyce, was a Dubliner. His education began at Clongowes Wood College, a Jesuit school, which is about 20 miles to the west of Dublin. And after a few years there, his father was no longer able to pay the fees, the tuition. And so he was returned to Dublin very briefly. He went to a Christian Brothers school and then became a scholarship boy at Belvedere College. It's still one of the top schools in Ireland, as is Clongowes Wood. After finishing at Belvedere, Joyce went on to University College Dublin. Joyce tried to ignore the fact that he spent a very brief time with the Christian Brothers and was very proud through his life of his Jesuit education. After he graduated from UCD, he went to Paris very briefly, ostensibly to study medicine, but in fact, simply to read and to get away from Dublin. He was already becoming an artist. He was very clear in his own mind that that's what he wanted to do, and I think he had a fairly good sense of the stifling atmosphere of literary Ireland, particularly Dublin. Despite the fact that there were tremendous authors like W.B. Yeats and John Millington Synge who were coming out of that period, it was also a very cliquish and a very regimented group, so that if you didn't conform to the views of the Dublin literati at the time, it would be very difficult to publish, very difficult to flourish, and I think Joyce at a very early age knew that. He returned spring of 1903 because his mother was dying of cancer, and he remained in Dublin for about a year and a half. He left in October 1904 to elope to the continent with Nora Barnacle, a woman with whom he would spend the rest of his life and whom he would eventually marry on July 4th, 1931. But at the time, it was important to him not to marry, not to conform to the social institutions that were so constricting in the Irish ethos. After a fairly short time, he went to Trieste in early 1905 and remained there for 2 years, teaching and continuing to write. While he was in Trieste, he finished most of Dubliners. He had written a few early versions of a few stories that had been published before he left Ireland, and continued working on Dubliners through that period. In early 1907, as a way of improving his fortunes, he thought, he and his family moved to Rome. It was a very unhappy period for them. They stayed about 6 months before returning to Trieste. But by the time he returned, he had inspirations for his final story, The Dead. By then, the collection was complete, and he was simply faced with finding a publisher. And he went through a great deal of travail to get a British or an Irish publisher to bring out Dubliners. The problem was that, according to British libel laws, a printer was as liable as the publisher or the author for anything that could be deemed scandalous or scurrilous in the work. And so printers could be extremely punctilious about what they produced. Their livelihood was at stake. They didn't see the same artistic value that the author did. And a number of printers and publishers resisted bringing Dubliners out, and it wasn't until 1914 that he was finally able to get it published. In the meantime, he had abandoned an autobiographical novel, Stephen Hero. When he went back to it, he had gone through a remarkable artistic change, a tremendous development, and began producing what is now a portrait of the artist as a young man. To call it a revised version of Stephen Hero really doesn't do justice to it, because he moved from a conventional 19th century fictional narrative to a paradigmatic modernist narrative. The storyline is the same, the development of a young man, closely paralleling Joyce's own experiences growing to manhood in Dublin, but the construction of it, the experimental stylistic representations, the creative imagery that he used was radically different from Stephen Hero. When he finished Portrait of the Artist as a young man, he began work on Ulysses. He had also took up a play, Exiles, that he wrote in 1915 and 1916. He was a self-created writer, although he had a great deal of financial help from other authors like Ezra Pound, who, for all of his flaws, was tremendously generous with other writers and took Joyce up in 1914 and really, for the next 7 years, did his utmost to promote Joyce's work and to help Joyce materially. And W.B. Yeats, as well, was someone who admired Joyce, who saw the great difference in their approaches to literature, but nonetheless felt that Joyce was a talent well worth his support, and he was very open-handed in doing so. Once World War I broke out, Joyce and his family were considered illegal aliens. Britain was still the colonial power that controlled Ireland, and so Joyce had a British passport, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was at war with Britain, and so he was forced to leave in 1915. He took his family to Zurich, where they remained for 4 years. And it was during this period in Zurich that he produced most of the first draft of Ulysses. After the war ended in 1919, he moved to Paris to finish his novel, Ulysses. He stayed there 20 years until the German occupation forced him into the south of France. He was able to concentrate his energies, finish his novel, and begin to search for a publisher. The difficulties were even greater than they had been because the language, the images, the representations were so much more evocative, so much more direct in terms of contemporary taste than it had been in his previous work. He had the support of an Englishwoman, Harriet Shaw Weaver, who was a staunch believer in Joyce's genius, backed up that belief with regular monetary contributions. Another woman, Sylvia Beach, an American who had emigrated to Paris and opened a bookstore, Shakespeare and Company, was also instrumental in the production of Ulysses. She met Joyce at a party, and when she learned that he was almost in despair at not being able to find a publisher, she proposed that she and her bookstore bring it out herself, and she did. 2 copies were published on the day of his birth, and then the regular run followed in several months. It's commonly thought of as having been banned in Ireland, but in fact it never was. It simply was not made available by Irish booksellers who didn't want that kind of filth on their shelves. It was banned in the United States, and Joyce had problems with a serialized version in 1919 of Ulysses being seized by the U.S. Post Office. 2 women who ran the little review being brought into court and prosecuted for publishing, in essence, pornography. They were convicted and agreed to cease publication. The man named John Quinn, who was very well known as a book collector, a New York lawyer, then very carefully prepared a copy of Ulysses to be taken into the United States and seized by the customs officer. They not only had the book itself, but clippings of reviews that they pasted into the book so they could be sure that it would become part of the evidence for the trial. There was some difficulty in getting arrested when the book was brought into the United States, because the customs officer first had to be pointed out to him that, I'm bringing in a copy of Ulysses, and then the customs officer's response was, everybody does. We don't even bother with that anymore. And so they had to insist on arrest and prosecution. It did result in a trial, and in November of 1933, Judge Wolsey ruled that it was not pornographic and could be printed in the United States. In the meantime, Joyce had begun working on Finnegans Wake, his final fictional work. And it was extremely controversial. Ulysses was highly experimental and a very sharp departure from the conventional fiction that had preceded it. But Finnegans Wake went far beyond even Ulysses. Joyce was fascinated with language and with the way we process language, with the idea that we don't simply take things in a linear fashion, but juggle a range of images, and the elasticity of words not only allows us to impose a range of specific meanings on even the most conventional words like good and evil and beautiful and ugly, but also the way language works with us is associative. So we begin to think of, as we think of good, we begin to associate it with experiences with goodness or with evil or the abstract concept or the inability to discern it. And so we stack ideas one on top of one another, even as we're going through the simplest of sentences. And Joyce was trying to catch that process. A number of people who had been his strong supporter, including his brother Stanislaus and Ezra Pound, broke with him over Finnegans Wake, saying simply, "You're wasting your talent. This is a solipsistic exercise in your own cleverness that has no artistic value." But there were others that became staunch supporters, and I think it was that kind of support that gave Joyce the ability to continue, and a tremendous self-confidence, a belief in his own genius that he had had from a young man in Dublin. He continued working on Finnegans Wake through 1939. By the time it was published, shortly before the beginning of World War II, it had been serialized to such a degree that the entire novel had appeared in fragmented form. But it still was a tremendous watershed in literature, and I think it is an achievement that has not been duplicated even by someone as talented as Samuel Beckett, simply because of the demands, the complexity, the devotion, the fanaticism that composing that kind of work would require. Shortly after Finnegans Wake appeared, World War II began on September 1st, 1939. Initially, the Joyces remained in the south of France. They remained there through 1940, and in December of 1940, they were able to cross the border into Switzerland and finally on to Zurich. In Zurich, Joyce suffered an attack of peritonitis, was taken to the hospital, and died there on January 13th, 1941. Ireland dominated Joyce's consciousness. He kept in very close contact with his family and friends after he left in 1904. He returned several times in 1909 to see about the publication of Dubliners and to become involved in a scheme to open a movie theater in Dublin, and which in fact came to fruition, a theater called the Volta. When Joyce went back to Trieste, the management wasn't able to keep it going, and it ended up as a failure. But Joyce had high hopes for it. He returned again in 1912, again to see about publishing. After that, he refused to go back to Ireland. His wife and children went back in 1920 in the midst of the War of Independence, and Joyce was terrified that something would happen to them. When his father died in 1931, he was very torn by it, but still refused to go back. As I said, he remained in close contact with his family and friends, and many of them would come to Paris to visit him. When he was writing Ulysses, he wrote to his Aunt Josephine Murray and asked her countless questions about life in Dublin, asked her to send things, just the most ordinary things, tram tickets or the like, that would give him a sense of what the city was like. And he saw from that world the possibility for a very rich series of narratives. He told a friend who was visiting in Paris in the 1930s, he said, "All my books are about Dublin. If I can get Dublin right, I can get it all right." And I think he understood that very well. That not to say that the experiences in Dublin were the same as those in Paris and New York and London, but human nature has the same challenges, And human institutions are structured in a very, very similar fashion. And so he could evoke the world through the very specific references that he used in Dublin. And I think that's what makes Joyce's work so powerful, that sense of humanity that he has that allows him to write about the most mundane, the most shameful, the most awkward of human interactions. In Ulysses, you get images of urination and defecation and masturbation and menstruation and anything else that ends in ION that we're ashamed of. But there's not a sense of dismissal. We don't leer at it because he always reminds us of the dignity of the human beings. Even if they're not perfect, and none of them are, we're still humans, and we have that quality that resonates within us. And Joyce never stepped back and sneered at his characters, and I think that's what allowed him to present them with such revealing intimacy and still keep our interest and our sympathy. He saw a redemptive quality in all of us. We remained human beings. We retained the possibility for goodness or for at least decency. And that's why characters like Leopold Bloom are so profoundly moving for me, because I see in Bloom a flawed individual, a man of limited intelligence, limited ambitions, but a man that feels the same kind of stress and anxiety and concern and ambition that anyone else would feel. And the representations of this man and the others like Molly and Stephen are unadulterated and with as little manipulation as any author can present. I think that's why Joyce is so powerful, is that he trusts his readers, and that in so many instances, ambiguity will dominate a passage, and it's left to us to decide, well, how does this character feel? What is really going on? And how do I understand it? Like Shakespeare, we can go back time and again at different ages and with different experiences and really appreciate what Joyce has written. King Lear is a great example for me, and the one I use in class a lot. At 20, I read it in a certain way. At 40, in a different way. At 60, in yet a different way. But the words are the same. Nothing changes. The ending is always that painful moment. But it is the evolution of me and of other readers, other individuals, that make the work different, and Joyce's writing is strong enough to accommodate those multiple perceptions and indeed invite them. But there was no one that I can think of who had the kind of courage that Joyce had to present us with these fractured concepts, to take away the transitions from one idea to another, to present a series of images much the way we think, or at least in a way that makes us imagine, oh, this must be how my own mind works. It's that representation of a human mind, unfettered, unfiltered, uncensored, in the way our conversation is fettered, filtered, and censored. That representation that I think really excited not just readers, but a lot of writers as well. I've been trying for most of my professional career to like Finnegans Wake, and to like it with the same intensity that a lot of my friends and colleagues do. And I haven't succeeded. I feel that I'm just not getting it completely, but I think that's okay. There are individuals who are completely taken up by it, who haven't read anything else Joyce has written except Finnegans Wake, and devote them a great deal of energy to engaging it in a range of different ways. And I think that's terrific. It gives people pleasure, and it is provocative, and it makes me think about literature and about the way literature is written. I admire it tremendously, simply from a technical perspective. The effort that Joyce is making to disrupt the Cartesian, cause and effect, linear way that we have to read, because there is a material beginning and material end to this artifact that's a book. And the ability that he has to rearrange the way I read within those physical constraints, I think is quite admirable. The Joyce estate made it very difficult to work with the primary material, and would often be very aggressive in curtailing any use of Joyce's works. There was a sense of an antagonistic attitude between the Joyce estate, particularly Stephen Joyce, the grandson of James Joyce, who is, for all practical purposes, the Joyce estate, an antagonism between him and Joyce scholars. He, in some cases, quite rightly protected the privacy of the family, but in other cases, he made it very difficult simply to work with the printed material of Joyce's that had been published. And I think having that threat of prosecution, and again, Stephen Joyce could be very aggressive in terms of enforcing what he thought was his right to protect the material of his grandfather wrote. Having that threat removed is a great relief to a great many people. He was someone completely devoted to what he was doing, and there wasn't a period where he began to sit back and take it easy and coast and phone it in. He was consumed by writing and by his writing, and I think that compulsiveness pushed him to keep finding something, finding ways of expressing what was in his mind, but what was so difficult to get on paper. And we've all experienced that, and I think Joyce, like all of us, struggled with getting those insights, those images, those ideas on paper. But he was relentless, and to me that was the difference between him and the rest of us in terms of writing. He wouldn't stop. That, more than anything else, is responsible for the evolution. It's only natural for each of us as a reader to take it personally. Why? What was he trying to show me? What was he trying to do to me? Why is he making me feel so uncomfortable? But I don't think Joyce was concerned with us as with getting it right, getting it the way he wanted to get it. Joyce writes a book that any of us can pick up and read without knowing Irish history, without being a Roman Catholic, without a sense of the Irish political scene or Dublin geography. There's so much in Ulysses that there is something which resonates with all of us, and there's so much in Ulysses that none of us are able to get it all. And that's a tremendously liberating sense once we accept it as readers, that no, I'm not going to find all the allusions, but that's all right. There is a fundamental human thread that will carry me through, and there are a great many allusions that I will get. The references in French or to Paris that I know all about make this passage clearer for me, and it gives me a sense of being able to continue and able to hold it together. Whenever I teach Ulysses to undergraduates, I tell them the first thing I want you to do is get a small bottle of whiteout, and whenever you come to a reference that puzzles you, just cover it up, and then you're not responsible for it anymore. And it's a way of trying to break the ice and trying to say, you don't worry about getting it all. Just read it. Just let it go. It's hard to do because we all want to get it right, and someone who reads Joyce is already highly motivated and used to engaging literature and getting things. And we can all get Joyce, but we can't get all of Joyce all of the time. And the best advice I can give is simply to relax and read it as it comes, and there'll be a great deal of pleasure there.